we should probably do the introductions again, but maybe you want to just take the mic first today and
Mm.
kick us off.
Yeah, so in terms of introduction, I mean, for this topic area, I'm doing a PhD in philosophy, so I'm technically a philosopher by training and trade at the moment, and I also do stage plays. I teach martial arts. I'm generally very interested in character, cultivation, wisdom, virtue, all that kind of stuff. And the Christianity thing is pretty unexpected. Like that was kind of the opposite of I was raised in a very secular household, like probably anti-theist in terms of hating Christianity. Like really, Christianity was the kind of bad guy in my life. So it's been quite a long journey, which I'd be interested to talk about in terms of doing a bit of a 180 on that after my first 29 years of life, um, which is has taken a while. But yeah, that's kind of a brief introduction, I suppose, to what I do and where my interests lie around Christianity.
Awesome. Well, it's good to have you on, and I certainly resonate with the sense of it kind of creeping up out of left field. That's very much the spirit of this whole journey and inquiry for me, and this idea of the return of Christianity. It's really not like in continuity with the church as it's been. It's this really for me isn't like, you know, the the characteristic revival trend that's gone on forever and ever and ever in Christian churches, where we're church, but we're doing church differently now, and it's coming back.
Mm.
This feels very different because it seems to be emerging in like really unusual quarters. It's not really coming from like people congregating in churches or being drawn into existing Christian communities, although there's a little bit of that. To speak for myself, and I guess you'll be speaking a little bit on how you've been finding your way into it. I know philosophy has been a big part of that, and I do feel that the wedding of philosophy and Christianity is a really significant piece. For me, it was
Mm.
a journey through plant medicine and psychedelics and meditation and exploring things which I don't really associate with the Christian tradition at all, which are quite alien to it. And I'm just noticing, because we're recording this video and doing the audio together, it's actually pretty distracting for me to do both at once. So
Yeah, just click on the. I think just click on the audio because this thing is not even recording at this point. If you want to just do that,
yeah,
yeah, sweet. Let's just stick to the audio.
cool. Yeah. So picking up on that note, I mean, it's been an esoteric journey to finding it, but I do seem to have stumbled into rediscovering some of the resources of Christianity. And there's a few of those that I want to speak about today, because that's what I really think is like the meat and potatoes of this conversation. It's not really about the revival of the church or the continuity of the church. For me, it's about these uh, powerful resources that respond to the perennial crises of meaning. A few of which I'd like to get into today potentially. One of them is this big picture recognition of a kind of metaphysical whole in the culture
Mm-hmm.
that that we're metaphysical beings. We're not just material beings. We're metaphysical. We have a spiritual need, and we're in a really unique historical circumstance where that's kind of been cut out. And so there's almost like a spiritual trauma in the Western world of being cut off from, in some sense, the ultimate resource, the thing that situates your life into something greater than your life, something eternal. And so that's really, really important for confronting the anxieties of existence and death. but I also feel there's something really important about redemption, uh, which is, of course, that the topic of that first essay that you and I connected about was one that you did
Mhm.
on redemption and really the possibility of healing that's available through the resources of this tradition. So maybe that's
Mhm.
those two things are like good pieces for us to kick off with.
Yeah, I mean the metaphysical hole in our current culture is that's kind of the root of a lot of the problems, isn't it? The yeah, yeah, I really 'cause I love Vervaeke's work, and even in Peterson's Maps of Meaning book, which I've been reading again quite recently, he attributes the origins of the meaning crisis really to the death of God, to the collapse of the Aristotelian Christian worldview that had been dominant for 1,000 years before. So there is kind of, I'm in two minds about it in some sense. I think there's the one solution, which is the Peterson solution, which is that we need you return to the tradition, the rescuing your father from the belly of the whale. You take the tradition and then you give it your attention, and that reorients it in the world with new eyes, and that's a continual process. And then there's what Vervaeke's doing, which is the kind of ecology of practices, the metacognitions, and kind of the rebuilding Socrates, basically, where you're engaging in these practices for a sort of metanoia, for more meaning in life. So I think Christianity, I've kind of fallen in because if the root of the problem is the loss of God, one solution would be finding God. Um, so that's
Mm-hmm.
kind of what I've been looking for, and with mixed, some pretty good results, to be fair, from different angles in terms of you mentioned psychedelics and that kind of end of things, and I also do a lot of dream work and active imagination in Jungian psychology, which I found very fruitful. Or I don't know if you're familiar with Park's work in internal family systems theory, which is also kind of again that kind of
Mm-hmm.
non-propositional experiences, which can be very profound. But I mean, for me, I'm a philosopher. I want like a clear-cut ontology. I want a nice metaphysics that situates the ethics and connects us to reality. So for me, Christian Platonism really did that and really started to show me the philosophical sophistication of Christianity, which I never knew about. I just thought it was like a bunch of disconnected, like it was you just people did these weird rituals that stand up and sit down, and there wasn't any real intellectual side to it, which was a real shame that I never really encountered that until really pretty recently through DC Schindler and through obviously reading St. Augustine and some of the other church fathers. I was like, oh, holy shit, this philosophy is like this is the Cadillac or the Lamborghini of philosophies. Like this is the really impressive, sleek, well thought out stuff that you just don't ever see with mainstream Christianity, really. Um, so I think the metaphysical whole Christianity has something to offer to fill it, but the mainstream church doesn't seem to be able to offer that to people. So it's coming from weird places, I think.
Mm, some really important pieces I want to pick up on in there. First and foremost, I really resonate with what you've identified that like the Christian church as we've known it, or the tradition that most of us have grown up in connection to, is so lacking in those deeper resources. It seems to be quite like deracinated, um, unrooted. Obviously, it was subject to centuries of schism and assault and deconstruction, much of which was necessary. But as you say, like when we actually delve in, as many people are now being called to do through philosophy, first and foremost, and we get back to the deep theologians, the Thomas Aquinas and the Saint Augustines and so on, we discover there's like profound depth, and there's a tradition that has been like the fruit and outworking of the highest aspirations of human creativity, philosophy, and existential wrestling, like all of that has been woven together over the course of, you know, many, many centuries in order to create the artifice of Christianity. And so, even though that thing has kind of been sidelined and it's fallen apart, and I will always say there are ways in which that was necessary. I don't have loads of regrets about that, but now seems to be a time to recognize the depth. And one of the ways that I do find that most is actually in the architecture, in the churches. They hold a hell of a lot of the meaning of, like, the highest meaning of Christianity is embedded in the buildings themselves. And if we want to
Very
get a
cool.
little bit kind of metaphysical about it, for me, I have been exploring the ideas of Rupert Sheldrake and morphic resonance, and playing with those in relationship to churches, and the idea that you can kind of tap into, um, if somewhere's been prayed in for 1,000 years, that's not nothing. It has some sort of material substantiality, and if you go and you kind of contemplate or pray or meditate in a space like that, then you can kind of tune into the field that's been cultivated in that temple. Um,
Mm.
so that's a resource that I think is really available to us. But so many people, it's funny, they're like, we don't know how to be in churches or in sacred spaces. You see people walk in and there's like this discomfort. It's like we're alienated from it, or we just go in and take some photos and leave, or it's like, it's maybe we're not conscious of it, but we're like coming into contact when we do that with the unrootedness and the fragmentation, um, in
Mm.
relation to all our ancestors.
Yeah, I'm in such a weird position of being like, I sometimes try to explain it to people in terms of like I wasn't baptized, I never had communion or confirmation, I've never been to a mass, I've been to like a few funerals and some weddings. So like for me, going into a church is largely like probably for a Christian person going into a synagogue or like a mosque. Like
Mm.
I have no basis really for understanding what a lot of it means. So for me, it's been like I never felt comfortable in churches. It never felt like somewhere that I was welcome or that I would feel peaceful in a sense. That was something that I've only in the last few years really, particularly going to Rome and going to St. Peter's Basilica and visiting those kind of holy sites that I started to feel a real connection to because I started to see, I suppose, the story because I started to understand the Christian story more and then started to see it woven into the architecture, like what you're saying, and started to make sense of the structure and realizing, like, wow, this is like the most glorious thing that human beings have ever made. And a lot of the caricatured version of Christianity that we see is just nothing compared to um, the depths within it. But there doesn't seem to be very good, I don't know, marketing for those ideas at the moment. I think a lot of it, the problem is our problems are so modern now and so idiosyncratic a lot of the time that it almost seems like the institution of the church can't help a lot of them. I mean, like the problems with AI, with changing gender roles, like the digital environment in general, and I think there needs to be a real an effort to show how there's solutions to problems still in those spaces. Even what you're talking about, like peace. I mean, obviously with a mental health crisis and those kind of issues, people are desperate for peace and for peace of mind and leaning into that a little bit. But it just seems a bit hollow. Like there isn't really much of a movement towards that. I don't know what you think. Do you
Mm.
think there's still solving problems for people, or that there's a bit of a disconnect between people are siloed in traditions and people that aren't?
Yeah, yeah. I want to kind of make a dual move here, which is to have like to have some degree of humility about how much I don't know, because there's so many
Mhm.
churches, across the land and in the world, and so
Mhm.
many
So
existing
true.
communities that I'm not aware of what's going on. I don't know the people and so on. But within my own field of awareness, everything that I've seen and experienced tells me that those communities themselves, the ones that are actually occupying those spaces, are also deracinated, meaning unrooted. Um, and often it's not really the experience of actual communion with God is not necessarily available when you go
Yeah.
into most of these kind of Anglican churches or what have you. They're functioning in some ways as like daycare centers and
Social order,
so
maintaining
it's like here's somewhere for old people
institutions.
to have social time. Here's somewhere where mums can come with their
Yeah.
kids. Here's somewhere to mark the Christian calendar. We have these holidays. A lot of people do show
Mhm.
up now for Lent and things like that, and you sing Anglican songs and you have a ceremony and there's a little bit of teaching, but
Mhm.
it's really nothing in the order of what I'm experiencing in online communities. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I think the point about mental health is absolutely astute. And the problem is that you actually need to have an experience of there being a there, as
Mm.
T. McKenna would put it.
Mhm.
And the church as it exists today is not able to give you an experience of there being a there. And if
Mhm.
nobody in your life has experienced it, if it's been like 3 generations, 4 generations, 5 generations since anybody had an experience, of a mystical nature, then it's like stumbling around in the dark. And how are you going to
Mhm.
find that? How are you going to know? Um, and so this is where I think things going on outside of mainstream Christianity are a huge part of the return of Christianity. And maybe there's a good place to put the distinction of like, what do I mean by Christianity? I'm not really sure, but at the core, I think it's something more like Christ consciousness. Um, I've described it as like Christ is kind of coming up through the ground of culture, and it's not necessarily happening in the church or even in Christianity as such, but it's definitely emerging through people, um,
Mhm.
and that it's that actual metaphysical ontological connection
Mhm.
that holds the medicine and holds the resource that can then
Mhm.
kind of flow out into addressing some of these problems and like ultimately giving people the feeling of like things are actually all okay,
Mhm.
even in the face of death and the worst of the worst. That's the true resource. And
Mhm.
maybe people can get that by going along to church community, but for me, I don't think I would get the resource I need for the depth of struggle that I've faced from the church and Christianity as it exists today.
Yeah, I mean that's just that's kind of the impression I have. I don't really know because I'm not in those rooms at all, so it's a bit of a judgment from the outside, really. But it seemed to me that the real revolution or the real revival has been on the internet, really, mainly through like Jordan Peterson and then the Wisdom Web, um, and the little corner of the internet, that kind of grouping. Because there's versions of Christianity that are like fundamentalist that I just find very unrelatable, that are clearly about, being part of the group or whatever and believe like the strand of Christianity I really identify with is the one that's also pursuing wisdom. Like it's the Augustinian, Christ is wisdom, Christ is virtue. And so by pursuing that, you can come into a relationship with God. God is intelligible but not comprehensible. And I think there's in a lot of religion that journey towards a connection to what's the most real, in essence, like Plato's cave analogy. Like you can't really justify that process in a lot of the mainstream kind of faith by the looks of things, because it just doesn't seem to have the, I don't know what you would call it, but maybe the know-how, but or they've just rejected the the journey to God in favor of the rituals and the ceremony. Maybe I don't know if that's fair because I'm
Mm-hmm.
not, again, not in the room, but I don't see. I mean, the idea of Christianity of having to become like God, which is the same in Platonism and Neoplatonism. The argument there is that you're meant to try and be like the Most High thing. You need to. That's what the moral purification is about. That's what the development of your character is about. All of the virtues are about getting your nature so that you can be something better. But that process of transformation, there isn't really transformations taking place. Maybe that's what I'm getting at. I don't see people transforming in churches that much.
Mm.
Yeah. It's more in these online communities where people are finding transformation.
Yeah, that's really, really spot on. And I will say, like, whilst I have not participated in Christian community a great deal in my lifetime, up until maybe age of 8 or 10, and then recently dabbling a bit in some Anglican services. My parents were very much involved, and I know a lot of people of the older generation who were involved, and a whole host of them have all exited, and
Yeah.
they've been in this decades long limbo, which we could call
Mm.
deconstruction, where they basically left something that was, um, the language around cults is quite inadequate today, but
Hmm.
it has some of those soft cult characteristics of, like, it's really good at getting you in. It's not very
Hmm.
interested in you getting out or going beyond it. It's quite
Yeah.
high dependency. Um, it's like, we've got something really good going on in here, and then maybe there's also a little bit of a, like, fear and rejection of what's out
Mm.
there.
Yeah.
Um, and that's kind of the flavor of a lot of it. And
Yeah.
also, it's not necessarily harnessing, like, the full spectrum of resources that are available. And that's what
Hmm.
I see in expressed in your essays and in this wisdom commons, is like, it's very foolish to simply go to church and get your resources from scripture, when we have also,
Mm.
all of the fruits of psychology and Jungian psychology and myth and
Yeah.
narrative, and,
Mm.
as you say, this more kind of horizontal ecology of practices that actually instantiate the wisdom, instantiate the love in a way that flows outwardly. Otherwise, you can
Yeah.
get all kinds of performative contradictions and things going on. You could have, like, a set of Christian propositions, but, like, no practical mindfulness to prevent you
Yeah.
being in a constant state of judgment of people, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, again, I kind of feel there's an arrow pointing towards something like, Christianity beyond itself, um,
Mm.
Christianity that actively seeks to be in dialogue and integrating the fruits of other traditions, and in the active cultivation of wisdom.
Yeah, and then meaning as well. I mean, the whole thing, if the meaning crisis has started from the death of God, then meaning should indicate somehow that we've kind of rediscovered what was lost. Because I think what you pointed out is so spot on with people leaving the church because they become disconnected from it, whereby it becomes meaningless or it doesn't make any sense, and there's no justification for what they're doing a lot of the time, so it becomes senseless. But I think that's an indication that maybe not that the rituals themselves are wrong or something like that, but just that we've lost the meaning, we've lost the understanding. They've kind of become cliched in a way, and so the need to rediscover the meaning of what you're doing rather than just continuing doing it would be a solution to kind of, because for me, I suppose it's going to be interesting because I'm going to get baptized, and begin going through these rituals and probably learn about them as I go, but with all this emphasis more on the process of the cultivation of wisdom and meaning. And how yeah, maybe we'll be able to see, because I just think we just need fresh eyes on it. It's just been very procedural for a long time, and it stopped. Because Christianity, in its origins, I've been reading a lot about like ancient Rome and Julius Caesar and that particular time. Like the ancient Christianity was mental, like nuts. It was the most unlikely thing to succeed, and they were all having religious experiences and visions, and they were martyrs, and like the only reason it took off was because they kept sacrificing their lives so willingly for it that it, shocked Constantine, and then he had a vision about it. So the idea that people shouldn't be having visions or shouldn't be connecting to the transcendent is it's just a stale modern version of Christianity that's not has become disconnected from its own origins, really. And so I think a lot of the solution is to go back to the origins of these things and to reinvigorate them, to find out what they meant before, and then to try and contextualize them for the problems we have today. Like even like problems like alienation, disconnection, um, addiction, like they're all oftentimes spiritual problems. So finding spiritual solutions to those problems in the history of the whole of Christianity and Platonism it wouldn't be, that wild of a thing to think is possible. Like, um, but I think that will be up to the next generation, probably, of people who want to continue on the tradition to justify it, really.
Mm, mm. Yeah, that sort of return to the origin, um, or like the notion of an ever-present origin. I haven't read Jean
Mm.
Gebser, but there's something about that phraseology for me, um, that that's sort of the energy of the metaphysics that underlies Christianity. It's not ultimately about like this narrative structure of something that happened 2,000 years ago that is linearly consequential on our lives now. For it to
Mm.
be really truly meaningful, it's like something that's kind of, in some sense, always happening. It's at the crux of the present. Um,
And that is the truth. Like that's what shocked me. So I was like, the truth is something that's so hotly debated at the moment, and all the post-truth talk and all that stuff. It's like,
mm,
if this is the truth, like we need to figure it out. Like it's the cornerstone on which our whole notion of reality is built. If we lose the truth, we lose reality, and that's very much happening all around us. So I think that's worth, you know, if, I think the only reason, I don't know if you ever read Peter Kreeft's book, 40 Reasons to be a Catholic. I only actually listened to the first one, which was pretty
no.
good. Is that he said the first and only real reason to be a Catholic is because you think it's true. Like that's if it's if you don't think it's true, you shouldn't do it. Like you shouldn't be, do something else. And there's so many Catholics that don't think it's true but are still doing it. And so like there's a real conflict there of I think it's true because I think really through Platonism I started to understand Platonist metaphysics and how it actually makes so much more sense than a materialist ontology, which I was never fully happy with. And that it's the most coherent worldview that I think we've come up with in the West. So that for me is like, I should be arguing for that really. Because if it's true, we need to be getting with the truth. Like,
Yeah. 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 And I mean, when you spoke to the early Christian world, and I like there's it's a bit of a job to actually break out of the constraints of modern postmodern
mm,
consciousness to be in the world of the ancient world. and what it was like, and the kind of landscape of possibility that those people lived in and occupied, the ontology, the sense of like
Mhm.
spirit moving in the world, um, the grit and violence and fleshiness of it was so much
Mhm.
more palpable. Um,
Yeah.
and there are so many accounts of like not just Christian but Jewish and other, like these eschatological experiences where people really feel like the end
Mm.
times are coming. They really feel like you know the metaphysical realms are dawning in the realm of earth, so much so that they end up martyring themselves, or entire towns or cities kind of all get into a kind of spiritual frenzy. um, and it's really a symbolic landscape and a symbolic order that's so hard for us to reach back into because of all
Mm.
of these waves of technology, printing press consciousness, and everything that's followed has made it so
Mm.
difficult to experience the world as they would have experienced it, and just how like imminent the idea of like heaven and the afterlife and God all
Yeah.
were in the medieval mind. um, it requires a imaginative depth and an imaginative opening, and that is, for me, is also where like psychedelics and potentially things like LSD in particular have been really important, because
Mhm.
I'm not sure without those kinds of experiences I would have been able to appreciate the different reality of the past, if that makes sense. Like there's a kind of
Mm.
perceptivity to be in a church or be in an ancient site of some kind, and actually like open your senses and delve in and uh, feel the resonance
Yeah.
of the past and imagine yourself in the past, and to see the ways in which things are not so different, to see the perenniality uh, of so many aspects of life, which is
Mm.
often illuminated in you know in any kind of mystical experience, really. And so it's like that's not the only way, but it's a significant piece. And it
Yeah,
seems
and
to
I
me
think I think there's such a reason for why that is such a significant piece, because it's the same for me, really, that doing LSD or mushrooms opened me up to that possibility. So did doing a lot of dream work in terms of recording dreams and interpreting dreams, because it's a
mm,
similarly non-propositional thing.
mm,
That idea of um, yeah, almost like it warms you up to the idea of other agencies in the world because you encounter them. I mean, who was it? I can't remember who it was. It was somebody was offering for, maybe it was Graham Hancock was offering Richard Dawkins to go and smoke DMT with him and go and meet aliens because he was just like, well, they're there, you can do it and you'll have these experiences pretty reliably. But I don't think Richard Dawkins was willing to do it because we live in that propositional tyranny that Vervaeke's always talking about. I mean, it's very McGilchrist as well is good on that. I think in terms of the left brain, right brain thing. That the I think it's the right brain that wants to live in a very clearly defined world where you can it's all logically enclosed. You even see that with the idea of causal determinism. Like one thing just hits another thing, and we can predict everything, and it's all kind of mapped out. But
mm,
it's a very different world to realize how alive everything is and open and possible within and without as well. I mean, that's why I think parts work and internal family system theory is so interesting because you'll meet parts of yourself that are totally alien to you and can approach you as such, and you can build a relationship with them, and you start to see yourself not as this monadic singular self, but as something um more dialogical and more like a city in the way Plato describes it in the Republic. And that's a very different mindset, I think, than the narrow kind of rationalistic scientific mindset that thinks of us as a monadic self and just ignores things like dreams, religious experience, you know, parts work. None of that's been integrated yet, I think. and we're
Mm.
really struggling to integrate them. Like they're nearly two different worlds. Like there's some science of mythical or mythological mystical experiences, um, but it's almost like an oxymoron or something because it's an experience. It's subjective. So the object subject divide that's built into the scientific ontology is really hindering that integration to a certain extent. But I think the ontology of science relies on the religious ontology fundamentally because you'd say science is good. You want to do science because it's a good thing. So it exists in an ethical hierarchy that's not exactly rational. It's a value judgment. Um, but I
Right.
think there's a real conflict there that's maybe being worked out in some ways, maybe not. I don't know. Um, it was kind of the cause of the meaning crisis, wasn't it? The discovery of um, the heliocentric universe and the downgrading of our subjective experience of the world in favor of third person descriptions.
Yeah. Yeah. This is it's really brilliant what you laid out initially. Like these pieces of IFS in particular is something that's been very alive for me in relation to Christianity. I literally did a little bit of impromptu parts work about 3 hours ago on a walk.
Oh
So
yeah.
very live
Okay.
for me. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Very interesting. Yeah.
it's become a huge tool,
Mm,
and I would say it's arrived in my toolbox around the same time as prayer and relationship to Christ has come in.
mm,
Um, and so there was a tweet by somebody, I think Rich Bartlett did a tweet kind of suggesting this. And then I kind of have been playing with it since that Christianity is, in some sense, like a massive externalized IFS, a massive external family system. You know, obviously,
yeah,
you have
that's so
kind of the
interesting.
more um, personal, in some sense, symmetric relationship with Christ as
Mm,
Jesus, and then you have Mary as the mother and like Mother Earth, and then God as
mm,
like the Father and the whole. Um, that's more at I'm playing with that right now, but I
yeah,
have found
yeah.
in prayer, like if I sit before a Mary Madonna, then I can kind of receive like more, like, you
Mm,
know, basically the presence of the Divine Mother, kind of the care of the mother as an external. Obviously, it's
mm,
kind of internal.
yeah.
And then, so parts work kind of in some sense relies on like you have this multiplicity of selves within you, but then there's
Mm,
this kind of like higher self, or I think they just call
mm,
it the self, like this like loving center that becomes the one that attends to all of those.
yep.
um, and effectively the move that is occurring for me in prayer is that that self then
Mm,
is the personalization of Christ. And so you come in relationship to him almost as like a metaphysical imaginal friend who comes
mm,
in through your third eye in a moment of need, and then offers the kind of love that IFS suggests that you give to yourself, but it occurs through this personalized um, external being that comes in, and then, as Chris Mastro Pietro was putting it in a recent dialogue with Ken Lowry, like the Christ person encounters you and all of your parts in wholeness. And so it's like through the relationship to the external person who loves unconditionally all of the parts together, then there's an experience of wholeness that becomes possible. Um, or for me, it's been like pieces that I just cannot reconcile, and
mm,
still cannot. It's like right at the
mm,
hot edge of my life inquiry right now is how does like the Christ consciousness and Christ come in relationship with like the shadow masculine. um
mm.
and like the necessity of the shadow masculine, and then like there's so much power and energy and meaningful virtues like assertiveness, courage,
Mm,
willfulness. All of these things are kind of connected with how much one's rooted in the shadow masculine, but then like how that fits with the all loving peace and acceptance of like the Christ self is a
yeah,
really
it almost
interesting
seems like
one to
a
kind of bring together.
contradiction or something. Yeah, that is fascinating, man. And because in Jungian psychology, Christ is the self. He takes Christ as a representation of the self.
Okay.
In Jungian psychology, the self is the sum total of the conscious and unconscious mind. So, in some sense, I guess, yeah, the unconscious contents are part of the self, but integrating them, the the expansion of the conscious self involves that confrontation with the shadow, with the unconscious contents that are then reintegrated in order to expand consciousness. So it's more self-like, it's more in tune with that broader kind of structure that is almost like, because Jung looked at the self as like a 4D structure through time. Like he had that strange idea that the things that catch your interest is actually your future self trying to actualize itself through your attention. These
Mm.
those synchronicities, things that shine forth, that catch your attention, is that's your potential winking at you as it's calling itself into being, essentially. I think Peterson sometimes over eggs that a little bit. Like in one of my last essays, I was talking about that with meaning. Like he kind of assumes that we automatically know where to go or what to do. But I think for me anyway, I was pretty confused ethically and didn't really know. I found a lot of things meaningful that I shouldn't have found meaningful, really. So I needed like a training in virtue, basically, explicitly, and training in wisdom. And so it might be good to note that, like in Plato's, you probably know this from Vervaeke's work. Like Plato has these three levels of the self: the kind of biological self, the social self, and then the human being who can care about like long term and short term stuff. But the virtues actually map onto those three levels of the self. So like temperance is for the biological self, and then courage is for the social self, and wisdom is for the human part, and then justice is the relationships between all four of them. And so the unity of those virtues is actually the good, which I think in Christianity is God, really. So it's like this ideal hypothetical personality, but that is that is in some sense realer than everything else. Because for ancient people, the the future self, the divine double, or whatever you want to call it, was realer than our current self. Our true self was that future self. So I think there's a ton of functionality there in that ancient worldview that's imaginal, but that supports our perceptions and our development. Even like the conscience, the idea of the conscience, like your conscience is an inner representation of an authority figure, but that's done by taking representations of authority figures' perspectives on your own perspective, and you build that up as you're a child and an adult or whatever. So like having Christ as the ultimate authority figure allows people to internalize Christ into their own conscience. So you can have a real relationship with Christ in your mind in that way, and that will guide you towards better actions that have a real effect on the world in such a profound way. Like I think there's just no scientific replacement for any of that.
Wow. Yeah, I haven't caught up on your essays, but I'm so glad you were able to synthesize that here today. Um, yeah, I'm very just grateful that you've been attracted to this and that you're taking the time to pass these things out and then to communicate it so
Yeah,
accessibly, you know?
trying to get better, trying to get better at it, but there. I'm hopefully like once I finish this essay series, hopefully I'll be able to like make some videos on it or something and like tie it together a bit more. Um, because I think there's real functionality there that like we really need. Like that's the big source of meaning, that connection to a true self or to, and it changes the ontology as well. It's not a it overcomes the nominalism, I think, that materialism has part and parcel of it,
Mm.
which is a more spiritual way of living, really, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think the piece that stands out for me is like um, this like vertical leveling of self, and there's something very helpful about that in relationship to my inquiry, because there's almost like it's as if there's like a soul level somewhere up
Mm.
here, at the higher end, and then there's a deeply embodied level.
Yeah.
And I've been
Mm.
drawing on these quotes from, Jung's idea of like your capacity to branch into light is directly proportional to your rooting in darkness.
Yeah, yeah,
And
man. Good stuff.
that's like, for me, that's shadow masculine, like right down there.
Mm.
Your
Yeah.
capacity for violence, your capacity for evil,
Mm.
you as the, soldier in the SS.
Yeah.
And then, like,
Yeah.
obviously, that's the extreme end of it. But sometimes you have to go to the extreme to really get what you're looking for.
Yeah.
And then Nietzsche's idea of Nietzsche quoted through John Vervaeke of, my spirituality running from the top all the way down to my sexuality, and like the two of
Mm.
those being on kind of like a vertical axis as well.
Mhm.
And it's tricky because when you get down to something like sexuality, you're in a pretty dog eat dog landscape in certain ways. It's like you have these soul level um, ontologies, and they have to be reconciled with the contending and finitude of the material realm. Um,
Yeah,
and,
and need to
and
be
and it seems
worked
like
out.
just one more piece would be like that. To a certain extent, if you grow in your soul, if you grow in your spirituality, at a certain point, that kind of like is gonna pop open or like stir up whatever's not
Mm.
um, conscious in those lower levels.
Mhm.
And a lot of the fuckery and a lot of the um, bad cult aspects, like the unethical cult behaviors and things that go on, going on as there's this huge like dive into spiritual community, is in some ways a direct consequence of this. That you have a big growth in the spiritual domain and spiritual language and so on, but then there are these like baser level, low
Mm.
stack things that not necessarily integrated, not necessarily conscious. And also, if you have a spirituality, Christianity being one example that kind of sidelines a lot of those baser things or maybe puts shame on them.
Yeah.
Um, but, it can happen in any tradition. When those
Mm.
things are sidelined and pushed out, then
Yeah.
they
Again,
tend to act out in unexpected ways, or they'll come through, and you get things like we've seen in Catholicism.
I think it was Paul Vanderklau that was talking about that in terms of like part of the reason Peterson was so popular about young men is because he was like talking to them about relationships and about how to be attractive to women and how to be high status and that kind of stuff. Because the church just had nothing to offer on that. Like there's nothing like the typical route of church members of getting married young and having kind of a culture that supported early marriages and starting families has just disappeared. And it disappeared, probably it started disappearing in our parents' generation, but by our generation, like unless you're both heavily involved in some sort of like Amish style church community, which there aren't that many of. It's probably not going to happen now. Like you're in a much more complicated dating market, much more complicated relationships and challenges with the culture war and with the roles of women and where how do you sort all that out is something that has created whole industries, I think, for particularly for young men, but also for young women, I suppose, that are looking for answers to those questions. And there's a lot of bad actors, I suppose, selling stuff that's filling that void, but that ultimately doesn't work. Like,
Hmm. Like initiation, I think, is the word that comes through for me. Um, and I've dipped in and out of men's work, men's circles, and found them very powerful. I recently joined another one just this week, run by Jordan Bates. That I got in there the first session, and it's all confidential, but there was kind of like a prayerful spirit already like in that group, even though it's not Christian and it's more like
yeah,
kind of space where people can talk about plant medicine and psychedelics and so on. It seems to me really, really that's a really important component of this, and one that's also not necessarily. I guess Peterson kind of epitomizes it, but in terms of like the current wisdom commons and the Viveki ecology of practice
yeah,
conversation, I don't see an emphasis yet on male specific initiatory spaces or relationships, or just even an acknowledgement of the specificity uh, of what that means in relationship to
mhm,
men and the consequences, all of the myriad consequences in society of like addiction and depression and nihilism or loss and not being in work and like all of the negative effects that come from
mhm.
not really properly identifying and uplifting this matter around male development and initiation. It's something that I feel called to like speak to and write about a bit more. Uh,
Yeah, yeah,
as with everything we've spoken about today, as a direct consequence of my own experiential learning.
mhm, yeah. Yeah, definitely, man. And I think the breakup of the family as well and the absence of a lot of male role models has accelerated that. I mean, well, obviously the Christian institution put a lot of pressure on keeping families together. Uh, Obviously divorce not being acceptable also kept families together. But also, I mean, God is a father that is a father for everybody. So for young men that have that father wound that are looking for it now, maybe in groups or in online or wherever it is, the manosphere, that used to be directed to God, and I think it is directed to God. I mean, that's Augustine's argument is that we have the God-shaped hole within us, and finite goods don't fill it, so we will continue wandering from one to another forever unless we actually start to grapple with the infinite, which is God the Father. And yeah, I think that's another big loss that we haven't replaced from Christianity. The initiation stuff I think is interesting because that's almost like kind of more of a warrior thing. I think a little bit.
Mm,
I guess
mm.
the initiation of Christianity is like confirmation or whatever, but you don't have to fight anybody there, so it doesn't really. It's not really the Spartan challenge, is it? Like the I did my black belt there in Bujinkan Jiu Jitsu a few months ago, man. I had to fight for 75 minutes, 25 3-minute rounds of
Wow.
fresh guy in each time. And that was always the big kind of challenge for me because my dad's big into martial arts, and that was the black belt grade and was the boogeyman. So it felt pretty good doing that. But I think there's ways to initiate yourself into life. Like you just have to find the biggest challenge you can think of and charge at it, and that will civilize you, I think, in the process
Fuck
of
yeah.
running, running up those mountains. But it's unfortunate that we don't have enough groups really to But there are some, I think, around. Martial arts is still a place where that definitely that kind of culture exists of initiation. Um, it's still quite, I suppose, I don't know what the right word would be, realistic. It's not too symbolic, just fighting people.
Yeah, yeah, albeit very important and still
Yeah.
still a piece that hasn't arrived in my life. Uh, although I feel like at the level of like the spirit of fighting, like the
Mm.
underlying reservoir of intensity and aggression that gives rise to the willingness to do that, that area has been like full on coming
Yeah.
online. And it feels like when I say initiation, like there's almost two meanings, because
Mm.
we have like there's like a formal initiation, like you get initiated into some organization, or like when I joined a fraternity in America for a while when I was like 19, and we had a whole initiation ritual that had been passed down, you know,
Yeah.
for like 150 years. And that was like that kind of initiation. And then there's more like initiation as a kind of natural given process that like it's happening to you in your life. It's
Yeah.
not like happening in this particular ceremony. It's like you're undergoing it. It's like when
Mm.
all that shit goes off and like all those challenges are coming, or you know, I don't know. I think there are distinct phases where you can feel like this is like this is an initiatory stage, um, and then having those those other kind of reservoirs to call upon in the midst of that is really important. And that's where the
Yeah.
wisdom commons and like all the things that aren't necessarily about male initiation but are
Mhm.
kind of wedding together a fabric of
Yeah. Yeah.
of
Definitely.
wisdom cultivation around us.
Mm.
That's there, and it is a little bit like fucking finding it in the wild. Like there's no
Yeah, I suspect more things will emerge in terms of it's something I'd be interested in doing, to be honest, that I've been looking at because it was Vervaeke in one of his recent, well, actually not one of the recent after Socrates, one of the ones, I think it was maybe episode nine or he was talking about Antisthenes, who was a follower of Socrates, who talked about their education back then. And a huge part of it was physical training, which would have been fighting and boxing and wrestling mostly. Like the gymnasium was beside the academy, the philosophical school. And then you'd be dialoguing, you'd be writing, you'd be reading, you'd be speaking. I think that type of education is going to come back because it's hard to know what we're actually preparing people for in the future. And if all the information is there, the machines can, do all that type of rote learning for you. I mean, what is there really left to do? I think an education and wisdom and virtue is the system that we're really looking for. Like, but it can't really be a bureaucratic thing. It's going to be hard to have a curriculum for that type of thing that you can just mass produce results on. But I think there's
mm,
teachers arising that kind of, I mean, Vervaeke's, even his circling practice and that kind of stuff that we did, I think is a good example of that.
yeah, it's a really interesting I don't know, like tension or paradox there of like you want the thing to be cultivated and refined. You want it to be substantial enough and resilient enough that it's kind of there
Mm.
for people to find it. But if it's just kind of given to you, you know,
Yeah.
the way that education, universal education, is given to people, then
Mm.
it actually hasn't required that discernment or that like degree of calling that you feel when you like stumble into or find your way into
Mm.
the wisdom, you know, the invisible college, the wisdom commons, the wisdom
Yeah.
web. There's that element of like being called to it and then
Yeah.
finding a
Yeah.
thread and pulling a thread, and you keep going down
Mm.
it, and then through that you meet other people and you have those relationships of mutual learning and mentorship or initiation or fellowship, um, and then that becomes kind of it takes on a substantiality as a fabric of
Mm.
community, of holding a space for wisdom in culture. And then I don't know if it's necessarily the aspiration or the reality that we live in that it ever becomes like uh, everyone part of it, or some collective
Yeah.
awakening of wisdom, or whether it's always
Mm.
kind of like um, a smaller circle of people kind of holding together the fabric of reality
Yeah.
through this kind of
I
thing.
mean, I think that is kind of because yeah, I don't think it'll do. It's not something that can really be mass produced very effectively, which is maybe where it does. I think it does take individuals to have that interest enough to pursue it, to make real leaps in wisdom. But I think that that can encourage others to do the same. I mean, through example and leadership positions, individuals can have tremendous influence. So I think really strengthening individuals is one of the ways out of the current situation that we're in. There's just been such a dearth of encouragement and um, just really, inspiring and meaningful education for young people these days. It's just such a bleak landscape in the bureaucratic kind of education system that, yeah, I think people taking on their own individual education online will have more. Isn't a final solution, but yeah, that seems to be the way it's going at the moment.
100%. Yeah, I feel that's one of the hidden dynamics too of education, big E
Mm,
education. It's like you could go through a whole journey with education, MA, PhD, and you still might not get like meaningful encouragement or like just that like substantial mentorship in life that
mm,
one's ultimately looking for in some way.
yeah, yeah,
It does feel like in the context of Wisdom Commons is where I've found like the most real encouragement, and there's something that actually like makes you as a person. It it's like self making to
yeah.
participate in that way. So um, yeah, how are you? How are you feeling as we potentially draw to a close this epic romp? We've just passed about an
Mm,
hour.
yeah.
Um,
I know. Yeah, I just noticed that there. I have to go in 5 minutes, but yeah, no, I've really enjoyed it. That's it's helped me clarify a lot of my thinking, probably raise more questions than answers, but I'm kind of just starting this journey in terms of Christianity, so I'll probably have more in the future once I get actually baptized. We could have another chat, see what I
yeah.
think. If I've reached enlightenment or anything, maybe might the secrets of the universe by then, hopefully.
Yeah, who are you gonna be when you come out of that water? Is
Yeah,
like...
I was wondering, do I get to wear like the outfit and everything? Like if you're an adult, yeah,
Right.
do they still do that?
I don't know.
Everybody,
Hopefully,
very
it's really
cool.
cold, so you get that cold plunge baptism. If someone's
Yeah,
interested in this,
Huberman would be proud. The
I
cold plunge
feel like getting in the
baptism.
river is a little mini baptism for me. But
Yeah,
yeah,
true. We need many baptisms these days, I think. Right, one's not
literally,
going to do
literally. Yeah, so it's been great, and I really appreciate it too. As we've covered such a span, and it feels
it.
like we've both developed a lot of thought around this
Yeah, yeah.
to be able to have this conversation. And in terms of like just starting out with Christianity, I feel like you and me both
Yeah.
pretty deep in compared to 2 years ago, but where I'll be in 10 years, who knows? So, yeah, I certainly am down to continue this. I feel like this is a great warm up for the next podcast, and would love to get you involved in the Wrestling with Christianity series at some point
Oh,
soon. Uh,
sure.
that would be dope. Get you in with with Ken and OG Rose. And
Definitely, yeah. That'd be awesome.
yeah, let's
I'd,
keep
yeah,
thinking creative about it. And I also love the idea of the kind of men's initiation education angle of this. And I think with your fighting background,
yeah.
you bring something to that that I don't bring to it, and so it would be good to
Yeah.
team up on
I'll
something down the line once an idea is
get everybody
emerging.
punching each other. Yeah, I'm up for training at 6 a.m. tomorrow and be giving out some abuse to the guys. So I can certainly do that.
Fuck
um,
yeah.
awesome. Well, thanks, Jacob. And let's do it again.
Awesome. All right. Peace, brother. Thank you very much.
Take it easy, man. Thanks again.